The Hebrew Scriptures invite us into a people, into a past we can only hear faint echoes of. They are readings not our own, and yet we mine their gems and must do so carefully. These are not our stories. We must approach them with humility. We got to take our shoes off in their presence, y'all. The trick is to let the Hebrew Scriptures absorb us without trying to absorb them. The trick is to allow them to teach us in their own language, in their own ways. The trick is to let them be what they are, the testimony of a people mighty and numerous who call to us from their experience on the margins with the Yahweh at the center. Come, attend to the word of the Lord spoken through a different tradition. Hear it. Listen. Let it grow in you. Let it be written on your hearts, on your hands, on your head, not as something to possess, but as an offering, fragrant and true.
In some Christian circles, Genesis 1 is often used to support a fundamentalist reading of the Bible. But in Jewish circles, we do not do fundamentalist readings.
Yeah.
We certainly have attachments to ways of doing ritual, and a lot of our interdenominational debates and disputes and divisions are over that. When it comes to the Bible, it's a basic principle that it can always be read in more than one way. And there are passages that we read literally, but nobody reads them only literally.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we also really want to talk about is why are the Hebrew Scriptures in worship, and why are they in the places that they are in worship? Like, why do we have a reading from the Hebrew Scriptures, and why do we have a psalm? And talking about the importance of why these are in our worship services, so we don't just completely eliminate the Hebrew Bible from who we are, and also perpetuate anti-Semitism.
The whole liturgy is rooted in the temple liturgy. I mean, it really is patterned on the temple. By the time this evolves, there is no temple, so that has been carried over to the Christian, and even a lot of the debates early were even about when you worship, whether it was on the Sabbath or on Sunday. That all that was revolved around. So the liturgy emerged in conversation with Judaism.
And the text of Genesis chapter 1 tells you not to read it too literally. And here's just the most obvious point. On day 1, God creates light. And you're reading along and you're just thinking in terms of familiar imagery, the created world that you know, and you think it's sunlight. That's what you picture, the world lit up by sunlight. And then all of a sudden you get to day 4 and boom, you realize no sun was created before day 4. So what kind of light was it? It's some kind of light that we don't know for sure what it is.
Huh. Yeah.
And if you take that lesson as a caution, then it's a reminder that as you read on for the remaining 24 books, the remaining 23 books in the Jewish canon, you have to keep in mind that you will always be surprised. Whatever reading you thought was the most natural and the most obvious might not be the right one.
As it lost its moorings from Judaism in the 2nd and 3rd century, Jews and Christians lived together for a long time. But what happened with the apologists, you start to have the tradition construed in terms of Greco-Roman philosophy, right? So that's to defend the faith. I mean, if you read the Gospel of John, it's the whole gospel structured according to the feast, the Jewish feast, all the feast stuff in there. I mean, that's the pattern. So all the New Testament texts are Jewish texts, right? I mean, they're all within Judaism. There is no Christianity. The only time that term is used is in Acts, and it's a Roman way of referring to these communities, which in Acts are called the Way, right? So
Yeah. We can't negate our history, because if we do that, we won't have learned a thing.
I mean, I'm old enough where we learned Judaism as background to the New Testament, right? And what happened is especially the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Christians got interested in Jewish texts, and then the pseudepigrapha and all these Jewish texts. And so all these people started reading Judaism on its own terms, including Christian scholars, and that revolutionized. It changed their understanding of Paul, changed their understanding of Jesus, it changed their understanding of the whole framework of the New Testament, that it's not background. It basically is, a lot of people, some people talk about, even Jewish scholars used to talk about Judaisms, but you're just talking about the diversity of Judaisms, right? You might have had an Enoch group. Most people think the Essenes were an important group.
Well, and this is also highlighted in the gospel texts as well.
Yeah, but the texts read differently, as you know, if you read them with that awareness. And this actually does speak to even how to understand liturgy. Judaism is a religion of practice. If you ask a Christian about their identity as a Christian, they'll tell you what they believe. But if you ask a Jew about their identity, they'll tell you what they practice. And that's who they are. And I think that's a huge difference, yeah.
It's foundational.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's a marriage, because I don't want to bifurcate the theoretical and the practical, but I think it's a good marriage of the theoretical with the practical.
Yeah, but it actually just reverses the order. So
You've got the practical and then the theoretical.
Yeah, that the theory emerges from the practice, not vice versa. Alistair McIntyre in After Virtue says is that every theory implies a practice and every practice implies a theory. But it foregrounds practice. It says, show me who you are, and then the theory, the theology, same thing as far as I'm concerned, but comes from that.
How many times have I thought about that story, and I had never thought, Rabbi, the light on day 1 and the sun on day 4.
Oh, it's just blowing minds. I love it.
Just to hear you talk, Rabbi, about how, and generally, like, Jews don't have a fundamentalist reading of the Bible. Like, there's too much of Christianity that has that. My God.
There is for sure in contemporary Christianity a lot of emphasis on the authority of the written text. In Jewish circles, we still hold on to the oral traditions, the idea that our Torah, our ancestral stories began as oral traditions. And when you have oral traditions, right, different regions, different communities have slightly different variations of them. You see that Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 have two different variations on the story. And also when you tell stories in community, I learned this from my Indigenous colleagues, when you tell stories in community, it's okay if people take some different lessons from the stories. All of that is in there. And sometimes there's even more in your story than you thought there was, and you learn from the way that people receive it.
In the liturgy, if we read the Hebrew scriptures in that way, as as something that could inform us in our way of being rather than ours, right? I think that could be an inroad to opening up the Hebrew scriptures for our community. But it's not. It's co-opted so often.
If your congregation dares not to read all the texts in the lectionary for that week or day, perhaps just read one of the Hebrew Bible selections. Listen to it, right? Feel into it, make it a theme, preach on it for just the way it is in itself. Because what usually happens, and the way the lectionaries are constructed, is to hear in the Hebrew Bible text the preview of the New Testament story, and that colors the way that people read it. And seek out not just Googling for favorite Christian sermon ideas that they can use, because I know people have limited time and they're often rushing to finish their sermon, but actually Google the text and look for Jewish sermons and see how people from another tradition tend to approach it.
It's not the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, I like Hebrew scriptures, Christian scriptures, but also I've heard like the Old Testament and the Older Testament.
It does seem odd that Christians would officially call it the Old Testament, because for the Christians that I hang out with, the Old Testament isn't old at all. It's a very living document, and people identify with the characters. They find life inspiration from their stories. It's very present.
So two major streams within Judaism, which are in the New Testament, are kind of the wisdom stream and the apocalyptic stream. And of course, they're both central. We've tend to, for some good reasons, because apocalypse just means revelation, so it's
unveiling.
Right. It's not
unveiling.
it's not like what pop culture is presented to us.
Yes.
Really, the wisdom tradition is foundational, and we tend to ignore that, right? And wisdom really is about both theory and practice. It's about it, but it's mostly wisdom in the ancient world, not just. I mean, the beautiful thing about wisdom in the ancient world is that there are no boundaries. Like, wisdom is wisdom. It just is, right? It's practical. And so I think that in my view, that's something that's been neglected, especially with Jesus, that he seems to really belong to not the high kind of esoteric wisdom tradition, but the kind of practical subversive wisdom stream of being, where he really is a teacher and a rabbi as well as a healer. And so it's very, very practical. It's a way of being, right?
The story of creation told through godly play. Did you know that there are some gifts that are so big they are hard to see? There are some gifts that are so enormous you don't even notice they are there. And to notice them, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, or maybe just before the beginning. In the beginning, well, there wasn't very much. In the beginning, there was nothing. Except perhaps for an enormous smile. But there was no one there to see it. Then, on the first day, God gave us the gift of light. Now there was no longer just darkness, there was also light. And this wasn't the light that's in a light bulb, or the light that's in a flashlight, or the light that's in car headlights. This is all light that is light. God gave us the gift of the light that all light comes from. When God saw the light, God said, "It is good." And that was the end of the first day. On the second day, God gave us the gift of water. Now, this isn't the water that's in a water bottle or the water that comes out of the faucet and is in your bathtub. It's not even the water that's in rivers or lakes. I'm not even talking about the water that comes down from the sky. This is all water that is water. God gave us the gift of the water that all water comes from. This is the firmament, which separates the water above from the water below. When God saw the water, God said, "It is good." And that was the end of the second day. On the third day, God gave us the gift of dry land. God separated the dry land from the water and gave us the gift of green and growing things. When God saw the dry land and the green and growing things, God said, "It is good." And that was the end of the third day. On the fourth day, God gave us the gift of day and night, a way to count our days. This is the sun, the great light that rules the day, and the moon and the stars, the great lights that rule the night. When God saw day and night, a way to count our days, God said, "It is good." And that was the end of the fourth day. On the fifth day, God gave us the gift of the creatures that fly and the gift of the creatures that swim. Not just the birds, but all of them. And not just the fish, all of them. When God saw the creatures that fly and the creatures that swim, God said, "It is good." And that was the end of the fifth day. On the sixth day, God gave us the gift of creatures that walk on two legs, like you and me, and the creatures that walk on many legs. When God saw the creatures that walk on two legs and the creatures that walk on many legs, and the great gifts of all the other days, God said, "It is very good." And that was the end of the sixth day. On the seventh day, God gave us the gift of a day to rest and to remember and give thanks for all the great gifts of all the days. There's nothing on this card because everyone has a different favorite place where they like to go to remember and give thanks and rest. Your place might be in your room, or by a tree in your backyard, or by the ocean. I don't know what your favorite place is. You are the only one that knows. But what I do know is this day is so special that the Christians mark this day with a cross, and the Jewish people mark it with a star, the Star of David. Holy wisdom, holy word.
And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down on a cypress swamp. And God smiled and the light broke. The darkness rolled up on one side and the light stood shining on the other. And God said, that's good. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands. And God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun. And he set that sun a-blazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it up in a shining ball and flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with moon and stars. Then down between the darkness and the light he hurled the world. And God said, that's good. Then God himself stepped down. And the sun was on his right hand, the moon was on his left, the stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. Then he stopped and looked and saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world and he spat out the 7 seas. He batted his eyes and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands and the thunders rolled. And the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed his finger to the sky, and the oak spread out his arms. And the lakes cuddled down in the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea. Then God smiled again, and the rainbow appeared, and curled itself around his shoulder. Then God raised his arm and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, bring forth, and quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. Then God walked around and God looked around on all that he had made. He looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things. And God said, I'm lonely still. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down. With his head in his hands, God thought and thought, till he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river he kneeled him down. And there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he breathed the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Amen. Read at Columbia University, December 24th, 1935. James Weldon Johnson.
Today's worship is brought to you by the Anam Cara community, one of the constellation of offerings by this new digital mission start of the North Carolina Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. If you want to know more about who we are and what we do, visit anamcaracommunity.org. And if you trust that this work and content are meaningful for you, please give on our website under the Give tab. We know God blesses us in beautiful and precarious times. Thank you for being you. And thank you for being here.